Hi everyone, thanks for coming back for part 2. In my last video, I was trying to draw the contrast between these two trees. There's one mentioned in Ezekiel 31, which seems to represent the Antichrist. It's referred to as the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and this is a tree that grows great in glory, as it says here in verse 18. It says, "To whom art thou thus like in glory and in greatness among the trees of Eden? Yet shalt thou be drawn down to the nether parts of the earth. Thou shalt lie in the midst of the uncircumcised, and with them that be slain by the sword. This is Pharaoh and all his multitude, saith the Lord." Okay, so you have one tree that's cut down in verse 18, but then if you go to Genesis 8:11, you see that this time you have a tree that survives. It's the only tree that survives the flood. And it's in verse 11 where it says, "And the dove came in unto him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off." So Noah knew that the waters were abated from the earth. And if you look at the word leaf in the Greek, you see that it's actually the word which means twig. It's the same word that's used as the mote that it talks about in Matthew 7:3 when Jesus said, "Why do you look at the speck that's in your brother's eye?" Okay, and the word mote is the word twig or a piece of wood, and I talked about how this is what's represented in the Sistine Chapel that was talked about in this video by Jonathan Kleck. Okay, so you can see this represented on this mural that's in the Sistine Chapel where it has the cross that's withering or falling down, and then a beam that's being erected. And Jonathan Kleck had explained how this was a representation of Matthew 7:3 where Jesus said, "Why do you try to remove the mote that's in your brother's eye and ignore the beam that's in your own eye?" Okay, and this is also the word that's used to measure the temple in Zechariah 4:10, right before it talks about the 2 candlesticks and the 2 olive trees. Just after that in verse 11, which, as I've mentioned before, I believe that represents the 2 witnesses. It's a parallel to Revelation 11:4, where it talks about the 2 olive trees and the 2 candlesticks. But this is what God uses to measure the temple. It's the plummet, and in the Greek it uses this word, which is gasitérinon. It's the same word as the mote, but as you can see here, it also refers to a straw, which is the same thing as a reed, which is what John uses to measure the temple in Revelation 11. Okay, you can see that here in verse 1. It says, "And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and them that worship therein." Okay, in addition, this word means a nail. You can see that here in Wiktionary. It's the same word, and it means a nail, a metal fastener used for joining wood. Okay, another thing that this word means is stannic, which means 10 with a valence of 4, and I had made some videos in the past of how this relates to what CERN is doing. Also showed some images of what tetravalent looks like. It's actually pyramidal in shape, but it's usually depicted as basically this imagery right here, which looks like a cross. Okay, here's an example of what it would look like, but it's depicted as a cross, as you see in these images. Okay, here's a better example of what that would look like. Okay, so this is what was in the dove's mouth. And so the dove represents the Holy Spirit normally, but it also represents the bride. Okay, I've shown these images before in the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 14, where it says, "My dove in the clefts of the rock, in the covert of the precipice, let me see your countenance. Let me hear your voice, for your voice is sweet, and your countenance is lovely." And I've talked about how this is a parallel to Zechariah 14, when we're sealed in the rock. And the word dove in the Hebrew is actually the word Jonah. It's a form of the word Jonah, and it's Strong's number 3123, which is interesting because that's very similar to the numbers that are the Strong's number for Eve. You can see it's the word Jonah. The next Strong's number is 3124, which is the word Jonah, which means dove. But the basic word for dove is Strong's number 3123. And it's used 32 times, which is 23 backwards. But if you look at the word Eve, you see that it comes up 4 times, and the first use is in Genesis 32, which is the number 23 backwards, and the Strong's number for Eve is 2332. So you have 23 frontwards and backwards. It means life or living. And this word actually begins with Strong's number 2331, and it goes through to 2333. Okay, you can see that here it's the word Hava, but the basic word for Hava, which is Eve, is 2332. I did a video with all these numbers and how they have to do with cleaving. And so it's interesting that the word Jonah is similar. It was Strong's number 3123. And of course it talks about cleaving in Ephesians 5 verse 31 as well. And so I think it's safe to assume that the dove in this instance represents the bride, which is sealed in the rock, just as Jonah was in the whale for 3 days and 3 nights. Okay, I'll go ahead and show you that verse in Ephesians 31. It says, "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh." Okay, so the dove is saved by the leaf and all that the olive leaf represents. And the word dove is Jonah, which is Strong's number 3123. And the Strong's number for Eve is 2331. So you have the same numbers for the word living, which is a form of the word Eve. It means to live. And the Strong's number just after that is the name Eve, which is 2332. But they both mean to live. It goes through to 2331. And so the dove is rescued by an olive leaf in Genesis 8:11, which makes the number 18 or 28 backwards, because if you add the 2 ones, that makes the number 28. And 118, as in Psalm 118, represents the year 2018. Okay, so I've talked about how there seems to be a pattern with the numbers 17 and 18 in the scriptures, how they both seem to point to the time of the rapture, the second coming of Christ, as well as the mark of the beast and the casting of Satan from heaven. They all seem to point to this time frame, 17 to 18. And so if you go back to Genesis 7:11, you see that it says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened." And there's been videos by Pastor Sandy Armstrong where he was told by God that the 600th year represents 6,000 years, the 2nd month represents the 2nd millennium, and the 17th day of the month represents the 17th year. Okay, so if you go to Genesis 8, you see that again it mentions the 600th year of Noah's life. It mentions the first month, the first day of the month. Okay, but then it mentions the second month and the 7th and 20th day of the month. And I've talked about how the numbers 17 and 27 are synonymous. If you actually go back to Genesis 7:11, where it says the 17th day of the month, if you look at this in the Greek, it actually says the 27th day of the month. You see that right here. Okay, I'll just show it to you over here so you don't have to take my word for it. This is a translation of the Septuagint of Genesis 7:11. And if you go to verse 11 here, it says, in the 600th year of Noah, in the second month, on the 27th day of the month. On this day all the fountains of the abyss were broken up, and the floodgates of heaven were opened. Okay, but in the Hebrew and the Greek, it has the 17th day of the month. Okay, then when you go to Genesis 8, again it mentions the 600th year. It starts out with the first month and the first day of the month. And this is actually the matrix that came up in the table that I did on the second Advent. This was coming right along the words Advent, and the word second was touching right against the word Advent. And over here it says, and in the second month and the 7th and 20th day of the month was the earth dried. And as I've mentioned before, I believe we're in between the years 17 and 18 currently, because as I've mentioned before, there was no year 0, and so you can't start the year 2018 and consider that 2018 years, because that would be like saying you're 1 year old on the day you're born. And so right now we're actually 2017 and a half, or 2017 and 7 months into the year 2018. Okay, so God has recorded this both in Genesis 7 as well as Genesis 8. It was in Genesis 8 where the matrix came up on the words second Advent, and I believe the second month and the 27th day of the month is just as Pastor Sandy Armstrong was told by God, according to his testimony, that the second month represents the second millennium, and the 17th day, which is synonymous with the 27th day, also did a table on that confirmed that 27 represents the Hebrew year 777. The very first line that came up in the matrix was the years of Lamech, which were 777 years. The very last line was that God would not strive with man for more than 120 years, and it's the 120th Jubilee. And so I believe the table confirmed that the number 27 is synonymous with the number 17. Okay, so in between these two time frames, between Genesis 7:11, when the windows of heaven are opened, and Genesis 8, verse 14, when the earth is dry, you have another date mentioned, which is the 7th month and the 17th day of the month. This is when the ark rested on Mount Ararat, which the word Ararat means to reverse the curse. And once again, you have the 17th day of the month is synonymous with the 27th day of the month. Okay, you have that over here. And if you look at the Septuagint, once again, it says the 7th month and the 27th day of the month. And of course, we've got the apocalyptic blood moon coming up on July 27th. I'm not trying to set a date. I just wanted to point this out. But I have a lot more to share concerning the I Pet Goat movie, but I'm out of time, so I have to do that in the next video.